My name is Josh Nathan-Kazis, and happy to be here and to have the opportunity to talk with Andrée about Doña Gracia, Mendes. No, Doña Gracia Nasi. Doña Gracia is one of those fascinating figures in Jewish history who doesn't easily fit into the categories into which we like to place stories from the Jewish past. She lived an extraordinarily public life, and yet she was a converso. She's a Jewish woman who was among the most powerful bankers in Europe in her day. She's a refugee who feuded directly with kings, and she almost looks like a proto-Zionist 300 years before Herzl. She's not a particularly well-known figure, although that's actually changed over the past decade in no small part to the wonderful book that Andrée has written about her. Sorry, Ariel, we got going, but if you want to do your intro, no, okay, we're gonna keep going.
I'm so sorry.
No. Due in no small part to the wonderful book that Andrée Brooks has written, who joins us today, and we're going to be speaking with. I'm going to ask Andrée in a moment to introduce us to Doña Gracia and her world, but first I just want to sketch a rough outline of Doña Gracia's life as a grounding and a starting point for our conversation. Doña Gracia was born in Lisbon in 1510 or around 1510 into one of the countless Jewish families. Sorry, the book title wasn't clear. I know there was it's called The Woman Who Defied Kings. There's a slide that I think you'll see later with a nice picture of it. Doña Gracia was born in Lisbon around 1510 into one of the countless Jewish families in Spain and Portugal known as conversos, who had at least outwardly converted to Catholicism amid intensive persecution. She married a leading converso merchant. She was widowed, and she eventually inherited control of one of the most powerful merchant banking families in Europe. She eventually fled to Antwerp and then Italy and landed in Constantinople. And along the way, she and her family were helping other converso families, escape Christian Europe for the Ottoman Empire. And in the whole while, she's being hounded by greedy monarchs, the Catholic Church, enemies within her own family. It's a thrilling story. So let's turn to Andrée Brooks. Andrée, I wonder if you could just, as a starting point, situate Doña Gracia for us in history for a moment. Just remind us what's going on in the Iberian Peninsula in 1510 when she's born.
About 15 years before that had been the great expulsion of the Jews from Spain after 1500 years. They'd been there forever, almost from the time of the biblical days. And life had been getting more and more restricted, even though they'd had a wonderful run for hundreds of years. At the end, it wasn't so good. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, decided they want an all-Catholic country, and they decided to expel them. But unlike other expulsions, they were given the option of converting or being expelled. And an awful lot of them decided to convert because back in the very early Middle Ages, there had been times like this and another regime. There'd been a regime change shortly afterwards, and they'd been allowed to go back to what they'd been doing. So they said, all right, we'll hang on, we'll hang about, and we'll say we're going to convert and we will be baptized, but quietly, we'll probably stay as Jews. The rest of Western Europe had also expelled its Jews about this time. So we had a concentration of Jews just about to be converted on the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal had not yet done so. And the rest of Western Europe had expelled its Jews. And you were now beginning to see them collecting or residing in Central and Eastern Europe. So that was essentially the picture. Who was on the throne? Well, the most famous would have been Henry VIII in England around that time, and the Medicis. And it was a prosperous time for Europe after they'd gone through the Black Death, which had been responsible for a plague that everybody thought the Jews had been responsible for.
So just to focus in on Lisbon, where she is born, what would it have meant to be a converso or a member of one of these families into which these Jewish families into which she was born? Was there Jewishness hidden yet? Was it about to be hidden?
Yes, there was Jewishness hidden. They had officially been converted, and her conversion, or her baptized name, because she'd been had to be baptized because they were officially Catholics, was Beatrice de Luna. And all of the documents we found in Europe, it will refer to her as Beatrice de Luna. She stays that way until she gets to the Ottoman Empire, and she converts back to Judaism overtly. So she would have been in a Catholic family on the outside, but they'd made a deal. The one thing about the Jews is that we don't hear about the brilliance of their deals. We don't hear about their victimhood. And in this case, the leaders of the community around the time, or just before she was born, had made a deal. And they said to the crown, look, if you let us keep our Hebrew books for 25 years, we will slowly get people used to being converted, because you can't do this overnight, and expect them to suddenly wake up the next morning as Catholics. And the ruse that they used, I love these ruses, was that most of the Hebrew books were medical books. And if they wanted to continue the benefit of Jewish doctors, they'd better not get rid of the medical books. Well, of course, they weren't medical books necessarily, but nobody knew the difference. So they said, all right, already, you can have 25 years. And that was the period when she was born.
I mean, the fascinating thing about these deals is that it implies there's leverage, and that these communities had power. And I think sort of to get at that is to get at this family into which she marries, the Mendes family, who, well, can you tell us about the Mendes family and how they became so
Well,
powerful?
they were the same family. Her future husband's name, Francisco Mendes, was actually his baptized name, Mendes. He was, they were all connected. They were all into marrying for generations. So they were, he was her uncle that she married. She married her uncle, which startled me a bit until I did some digging and found out that among the leading families on the Iberian Peninsula, it wasn't uncommon. It kept the money in the family, it kept control in the family, and that was the way they did things. So she married her uncle, and his converted name was Mendes, but her real name, his real family name was Benveniste. And the Benveniste today is quite common among Sephardic Jews. It's not an unusual name at all.
But tell us about the wealth and the business that
the wealth had come as she grew up from spice trading. They had managed the spice trade for the Portuguese. The Portuguese were a very backward, essentially a fishing community with not many years before they arrived, and they didn't have sophistication. And they'd found the sea routes, the eastern sea routes to the Spice Islands, the Malacca Islands, just beyond India and in India. And although we concentrate on Christopher Columbus at that time, the actual wealth was being generated by the Portuguese trading spices from India. And how did they trade? Well, they looked to these people, the Mendes, the Benveniste, whichever you want to call them, the Nasis, and said, look, you know about international trading. We want to turn this find or these voyages into good money. Will you help us? And that was one of the ways they really made a lot of money.
And what their role was actually operating the ships or financing the expeditions?
Both.
What I didn't understand and what my was how they got the capital out of Spain, because these people had come from Spain, like a generation or two before.
Because they outwitted and outfoxed the authorities. That's why the reason I love the story, because we don't hear enough of them doing that. They did so, Josh, by using letters of exchange or bills of exchange, which were just pieces of paper. It was as though they were prohibited from taking out gold and silver, and the authorities thought that was it, that we're not going to lose all of our gold and silver. Well, they forgot about little pieces of paper. And these little pieces, these bills of exchange or letters of exchange, meant that if you deposited some money here and you could pick it up there, there would be a lot of money, of course, taken out for the brokers, but you could transfer your money in a paper transfer the way you can do it in an electronic transfer today. They were far ahead. I mean, and so they got their money out of Spain when they had to leave by using these bills of exchange.
And so the crown's sophistication was not the financial sophistication of the Spanish crown was not at their level or at a level in which they could stop this.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. They could only think of money in terms of gold, silver, plate, and real hard stuff.
So you mentioned before the deals that these community made. I think the most amazing example that you talk about in this sort of Lisbon period of her life is the specific exemption that her husband secured for the family, with her named from the Inquisition, essentially from the Vatican. How did that work? How common was that?
No, the Inquisition was run locally in Spain, but
so what was this document they got from the Vatican?
Came from the Vatican. That was the sort of overlord. And what happened was that this was a time when the Catholic Church was supremely corrupt. In fact, it was just the moment when the Protestants in the north under Luther were starting to say, we don't even want to be Catholic anymore, because all you do is collect money to the Catholic Church. And one of the ways they collected money was they took these fancy bribes. And if you bribed the Vatican enough, you got your exemption. If you wanted a pass to get from here to there, and you wanted to bypass the king, you paid for an exemption. So they kept bribing the Pope or the Vatican or the Catholic Church in general for whatever they needed. And it was as simple as that. And it was so open that Martin Luther then starts in the north and saying, wait a minute, this church is run on money. It's not run on anything else.
Right. It's fascinating. And so this paper they secured from the Vatican, what did it do for them?
The exemption, it meant that it overrode any thing that the local Inquisition office, which was called the Holy Office, I love that too, the Holy Office could do to them. It was supreme.
And how common would it have been for a Jewish family to have one of these exemptions?
Well, if they were wealthy enough, I don't think it would have been uncommon, but there weren't that many with the kind of ducats, the not dollars in those days, ducats, to do this. But they had the money, and they had, you see, the other thing was that when you were a merchant prince in those days, they were just coming into power. Before it had been the aristocracy with their lands. At this point in history, the merchant princes, they were called merchant princes, were coming into the fore with cash and capital. Mm-hmm. And if you wanted to borrow money from any of them, and all of the kings and all of the courts did in Europe, because they were always not making enough in revenues any other way, if you wanted to deal with the merchant princes, then you had to deal with them the way their rules were. Mm-hmm. And they set out what they wanted in the loans. If so, say Henry VIII again, because he's so well known, he came knocking on the door through his finance minister, Thomas Cromwell, to the money merchants. And the money merchants were in Antwerp, like sort of Wall Street. They were the Wall Street of the day, and said, I need a loan for, £100,000 or whatever he needed. And they said, fine, and this is the collateral we need. You have to pledge this, this, and this, because, the laws weren't going to protect them. So they had the whole thing set up, and they had it set, they were just setting up, I suppose is better to put it that way. So capitalism as we know it today was just emerging.
There's an important thing that happens in this point of the story that sort of pivots the course of Doña Gracia's life, or as she's known at the time, Beatrice. Her husband dies and she becomes a widow. And I wonder if you could talk about widowhood and the benefits that it held for an ambitious woman of her station.
Yes, she had only been married a handful of years because he was her uncle, and obviously he was 20 years or so her senior, so he doesn't last very long. I don't think he died of anything but natural causes, but nobody lived longer than their 40s in those days anyway. So she becomes a widow, yes, and they've had a little child who's about to, we don't know exactly her age. Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful time. I mean, it's hooray. I shouldn't say it that way, because I think she really did love him. For any woman who had married, because why? Before she got married, she was under the thumb of her father. This is any woman in those days, and certainly any aristocratic or top-level wealthy woman would have been under her father. Whatever her father told her to do, she had to do legally and any other way. And while she was married, of course, all of her assets and all of her decisions had to be funneled through her husband. It was the husband who held the legal right to whatever she wanted to do. But if the husband dies, it's freedom time. It's hooray time. I can do whatever I like. I can call the shots. I can make the decisions. And what we see very shortly thereafter is how quickly she seizes this opportunity and says, okay, don't deal with the men in the family, because of course her husband had brothers and normally the decision-making would have deferred to the brothers. No, she takes it very immediately. We see with letters that come from the Vatican, we see it with almost anything, that she is now signing the correspondence. She is the one in charge.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So what happens shortly after the death of her husband is that she moves to Antwerp. And as you mentioned a moment ago, Antwerp was sort of the center of early pre-modern or early capitalism at that point. And she goes to live there where her brother-in-law, who I guess is also her uncle, another uncle named Diogo, lives. And he becomes, as you write, the head of the family after Francisco dies. I wonder if you could briefly just help us understand how the situation for these conversos would have been different outside of the Iberian Peninsula in a place like Antwerp. How free were they there?
Much freer.
Mm-hmm.
Because in those days, with the rise of capitalism, we also had the rise of the cities as autonomous places to live. They were titularly or supposedly under the local ruler, like the Holy Roman Emperor at that point and the Queen Marie, but actually they did their own thing. They were given a tremendous amount of freedom. And so if they decided we don't want Inquisition, we don't want anything like that in Antwerp, we won't have it. So the merchants, the leading merchants, and Diogo was one of them, was able to dictate terms to the city and say, look, if you want us here because we're bringing in so many jobs and we're humming along and the economy is great.
Sure.
Oh, you'd better give us, A, B, C, and D. And one of the things was that they would accept the incoming refugees if they could get them out. And this is where she comes in of Portugal and onto Antwerp by ship.
Well, so let's talk about that, because as you say, from Antwerp, Diogo and then later Doña Gracia or Beatrice begins helping conversos escape from the Iberian Peninsula. So tell us what they were doing, how they were helping these people. And
okay, well, the thing that they were doing was that they were providing the ships to bring them to Antwerp and then giving them instructions how they should move on from Antwerp down.
And these are people who are in Portugal or people in Spain. They're not in Spain anymore.
Yeah, they are. They came over the border. There were a lot that were coming over the border and going out through Portugal. So it wasn't quite the time when the two countries were to be combined, which would be a little later. But nevertheless, a lot of those were in fact originally Spanish, who had either come before or at the time of the official expulsion in 1492. So they were both. How did they get them out? Well, those are the details that are so interesting, at least to me. I wanted to know those kinds of details. Well, it seems to be that, again, they were very clever. They got them out this way. First of all, they put them on the spice ships. Don't forget, they were the big spice brokers, and the ships belonging to them were always coming into the Lisbon harbor from Antwerp, back and forth with spices and whatever else they were taking up there and bringing back. So you could get quite a few onto those ships and up into Antwerp that way. And we have some testimony that I got from Antwerp when they started to interrogate some of them coming in for a short while to find out how they did it. Well, it seems that they got them onto the ships at night in the harbor on the far side of the ship. How did they get them from the street to the harbor? Well, interestingly, in recent years, they have done a lot of renovations on the old medieval houses that were in the neighborhoods, which we might today call a Jewish neighborhood, and found a lot of internal doors where you could move, say, from number 1 on such and such a street to number 15 on such and such a street without ever going into the street. So they could hide the fact that a lot of them were going onto the port by making sure they went in and out at different places, which again I mean, why do we always look at them as victims? They were not stupid people. I mean, they knew exactly how to work the system, and they did work the system.
Maybe this is an obvious question, but why the secrecy? Were there bans on them leaving, or was it bans on them taking capital with them?
Yes, there were bans on them leaving and taking capital with them.
Uh-huh.
So, they put their needs for the journey into maybe a wicker basket and apples and hard biscuits and whatever they took with them. But they weren't. Was it that they were allowed to leave Spain but not Portugal, or they weren't allowed to leave at all? Well, they weren't allowed to leave at all, but they seemed to be able to get there.
Get to Lisbon.
And they slipped through the cracks.
And then once they're in Antwerp, once the spice ship has snuck them out of the port, over to Antwerp, where do they go?
Well, in some of the documents, it tells us that one of the first places they would go is knock on the door of the mansion of Diogo Mendes, who was one of the big leaders of this escape network. It's an escape network, essentially. And he would give them all of the papers and all of the instructions from there on in. Once you get here, the way you do is you go over the Alps to Italy, and you take a boat from Venice. Now, why couldn't they taken a boat from Lisbon? Because there were hostilities. You have to understand that all of those countries were warring with each other. And the Ottoman Empire was the biggest foe of Western Europe at the time. And it was very difficult to get to the Ottoman Empire directly. You had to go a very circuitous route. And the circuitous route that they encouraged, or they could direct for the refugees, if you can call them refugees at this point, which you can, was to go up to Antwerp and then down over the Alps to Venice. Now, Venice was one of those sort of Switzerland-like places where the business of Venice was business. And you wanted to pay for passage to the Ottoman Empire. We don't care that they're Muslim and you're Christian. We'll just take your money and put you on the ship. So the Venice was the place where they could take a ship onwards to the Ottoman Empire.
And the basic idea is that in the Ottoman Empire, they could live openly as Jews safely and not have.
Now, why did the Ottoman Empire want them and encourage them and welcome them when Christian Europe was kicking them out? Well, the Sultan even says, you're crazy to kick them out. They are the most useful citizens you could possibly have. They're some of the most literate people we have. And we want them. We'd love to have them. So why not encourage them to come here?
Do you have a sense of the scale of the operation that this family is running? I mean, are they materially contributing to the growth of what became great centers of Sephardic life in Salonika and Izmir and other parts of the Ottoman Empire, or are those sort of large populations getting there in other ways at other times?
I wouldn't put it in Sephardic terms, and I always bristle when someone introduces me for this sort of a talk and says she was a Sephardic heroine. She wasn't. She was a Jewish heroine, and I make the example of when Doña Gracia's nephew, who was her partner, Don Joseph, goes to the ports in Venice and a couple of the other ports and helps them onto ships, which the family has commandeered to take them to the Ottoman Empire. He doesn't have a clipboard that says, "Are you Sephardic?" If you're Jewish, you're in.
But there is a smart Sephardic identity that grows within this Iberian diaspora.
Now, why does it grow particularly in Salonika? Because a lot of them went to Salonika. And a lot of them were, in fact, Sephardic. The conversos were mainly Sephardic, there's no question about it. But it wasn't only the conversos from Spain and Portugal that were on this route. There were a lot of local Italian Jewish communities that were suffering because the Pope was making life very difficult for them, that wanted to get out. So it wasn't wholly Sephardic, but it was largely Sephardic.
So there is Catholic opposition, and you write about various efforts over the years of the Catholic authorities to break up this effort that this family is running. You talk about two particular men, Scheperis and John Vuisting. I apologize for but you also talk about a murder plot that was hatched by Diogo and Doña Gracia apparently to stop them. Can you talk about this murder plot?
Yes.
For this alleged murder plot, I suppose?
Yes. Well, what happened was that the Duchy of Milan, these were all small city-states. The Duchy of Milan had these gentlemen as the leaders there, and they were determined to stop them getting through. So they would raid the parties coming through, take their goods away, and if possible, put them into prison. And so it was a problem on the escape route that they had to clear up. So they got some of their other agents, one in London and one or lots other places, and they got together and said, look, what are we going to do with this guy? He keeps giving us trouble. So they hatch a murder plot that one of them is assigned to go and assassinate these guys. And I don't think they got assassinated. I didn't find anything on that. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I don't think it did. But Doña Gracia herself, when she goes on that route, because she has to leave Antwerp after a while, things are getting a little bit hot under the collar there too. And she gets at least one trunk of goods or of personal possessions taken away from her. And she spends nearly 4 years trying to get it back. She said, you can't confiscate my belongings. They belong to me. You've got no right. So how did they murder? We don't know, because I don't think they got to him in the end of murder.
I want to get to the flight from Antwerp, but first of all, I think it's important to mention that Diogo dies while they're living in Antwerp in 1543, and essentially names Doña Gracia as his successor to lead the family business rather than his wife, who is Doña Gracia's sister. So this is what sort of, in my understanding, elevates Doña Gracia to this position of enormous authority. I just want to wonder if you could emphasize how rare it would have been for a Jewish woman to be in this position of power at that time.
Unless she was royal, it would have been very, very rare. It was, and some people say she was the richest woman or had the most assets under her control of any non-royal woman in Europe at the time. And I think that's probably true. So yes, it was so rare that we do have some documents that show that when she went to live in other places, like for instance, Venice for a while, she had to apply for the right to sign documents, to lead the business, and to be the person in charge. It didn't come automatically because she was a woman, and she complained about that, and she resented that.
Eventually, as you say, the family leaves Antwerp and they go to Italy, first to Venice, and then I believe to Ferrara. And at this point, relations between her and her sister Brianda really fall apart. A lot has been made of this. It's got soap opera qualities, and I think in much of what has been, much of the story that is told about this woman is involved with this feud with her sister. I just wonder if you could talk about your take on what happened between them, and also why it's such an important part or such a central part of how they are discussed.
I think it's wrong. I don't think it was a central part of her life as much as it's been made of it, but it's a wonderful way to dramatize a part of her life without bothering with any of the other parts of her life. It was important, but it wasn't key. What happened was that when she was given the whole business to run by her brother-in-law, Diogo, before he dies, her sister feels left out of everything, because along with being given the right to run the international business, he also gave her the guardianship of their newborn daughter, the newborn daughter of Diogo and his wife, Brianda, who was Doña Gracia's sister. So she feels left out. She feels hard done by. And she doesn't like the deal at all. And I don't blame her. She's been left on. Why is she being left on the side? Well, he had a good point. She was a party girl. She was, as far as I can gather, she quite a bit got drunk. And she was not reliable whatsoever. In fact, in part of when we read about the murder plot or the intended murder plot in India, they worry that Brianda may know the details and give them to somebody else who's going to betray the plot. So Brianda was not a team player in any way. She was a party girl. She wanted a good time, and that was it. And so her husband, Diogo, doesn't trust her with anything, not even her own baby daughter. So all of that power is given to Doña Gracia. and amends that the sister is feeling aggrieved. Well, obviously she's feeling aggrieved. And she then does her best to undo, if you will, her Doña Gracia. She pulls her Doña Gracia before an Inquisition court in Venice. She makes trouble for her in Ferrara. She makes trouble for her wherever she can, but she doesn't really succeed. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of sad, but she doesn't. But the sister feud, well, of course, that's wonderful, dramatic fodder.
Yeah. So they spend some time in Ferrara, but I want to move on to the Ottoman Empire, or the piece of her life that's spent in Constantinople, because I think it's so important. First of all, when they arrive, she changes her name to the name we've been using, Doña Gracia Nasi, away from the earlier names that she's used. Can you talk about what that signified and what it would have meant to begin living openly as Jews?
Oh, I think it's tremendous. I think changing her name back, we have a wonderful document where one of her friends, who's the Duke of Ferrara, writes to her, and we have where he's crossed out Beatrice de Luna and he's put in Gracia Nasi. He's not sure what he should call her. And that sort of says everything. It's a wonderful, wonderful document.
I can empathize with that. Not sure what to call her.
No, he's got both in there, covering his bases. And it would have meant everything. We know this because very shortly after they get there, she has been worried that her daughter, Anna, or La Chica, as she's sometimes called, the little one, is beyond marriageable age and was supposed to marry the partner and nephew of Doña Gracia. As I say, they keep marrying within the family. And they put off the wedding until, as far as Doña Gracia is concerned, she can make sure it's a Jewish wedding. And soon after they get to Istanbul or Constantinople, there is a great wedding, and it's written up by the French ambassador as really a phenomenal wedding. It must have been fabulous. And that is when, of course, she's using her own name and she's living openly as a Jew. But there's a big but there. If she thinks that the Jews are just going to accept her, the ones already there, and they're going to love her, she's right and she's wrong. The people love her, La Signora they call her, because they know of what she's done for them. But the clergy hate her. The clergy do not like her. And I think that was something she again had to fight for. And she used to fight every inch of the way, because they had a distrust and dislike of the conversos. Mm-hmm. They were utterly impractical. They said, well, they should have left instead of accepting baptism, that they were trying to ride what they called a boat with two rudders. And they felt that they were opportunists, the conversos. They were going to become Catholics for as long as it served them and then go back to being Jews. So they didn't like them. Mm. So they did mean things in a way, like saying, well, if you were married while you were in Spain or Portugal and you were married in church, we don't recognize your marriage, so that your children are illegitimate. I mean, they really did some rather nasty things.
And one also wonders whether their practice, their Jewish practice, would have been traditional at that point, right? Whether their memory of
They didn't need memory, because what she did, she said, okay, you don't like what we do, you don't like what we did, I'm going to start my own synagogues. And that's what she did. She started a number of synagogues. She brought in rabbis who were sympathetic to the trials and tribulations of these conversos, and who weren't quite as hard case when it came to the rules.
And it wasn't just synagogues, right? She funded Jewish institutions and yeshivas across the empire.
Yes, whatever she could. But she found that the conversos, and it's a very interesting thing, Josh, because today the descendants of the conversos who are coming back to Jewish life in Central and South America, and there are hundreds of them, are finding that they don't fit into traditional Jewish congregations in America. And they go in, and after a year or two, they feel like outsiders, and they don't think they're understood. And if there's enough of them in one geographic location, they form their own congregations, which is what is happening today once again. And she did the same thing back then. She found sympathetic rabbis, and she did her own thing to help them have their own synagogues, which they did.
And how important were the institutions that she created to sort of, building the infrastructure for a Sephardic Jewish community that lived for, centuries in those places up until?
Oh, I think she was very instrumental. I think it was extremely important. However, it wasn't all a straight line. It never is. We have a little book written, or so-called written, by her nephew, Don Joseph Nasi. At some point while she was in the Ottoman Empire a few years later, where he laments the fact that he can't get them all to join. He can't get them back to Jewish life. They're saying, a pox on both of your houses. The Catholics have treated us badly. The Jews don't seem to want us. I don't want to be anybody's person. And a lot of them will just leave Judaism. How they quite left Judaism in those days is something that I'm not sure I understand, because you had to be in somebody's camp. You couldn't be like today. You could just walk away. You couldn't then. So maybe they just said, all right, I'll be a Jew, but I won't even bother to participate. So I don't know, but they weren't happy with, and poor John Joseph writes in this book how, the family done so much for them, and then they turned away even from Judaism.
I think maybe the strangest and most interesting part of the story comes almost at the very end of Doña Gracia's life. She gets permission from the Sultan to build a Jewish settlement in Tiberias in Palestine. To basically, a proto-Zionist, or one could frame it as a proto-Zionist effort to, settle Jews in the land of Israel. Why did she do this? Was this messianic? Was this practical solution to the sort of problem of converso displacement? Do we understand what was behind this?
Yes, we do. It's very clear. She did not trust the Ottoman Empire any more than she trusted Christian Europe. She really felt that without their own country, the Jews would always be outsiders. She just had seen too much trouble.
You should write in those terms of a state?
Yes, eventually, yes. First of all, so she goes to and the interesting thing is that it's all written up as though it was John Joseph's idea. And then we finally, if we, peel the layers back, we find it was her idea, and she is on some of the documents, even though the original historians who did some of this work insist that he would have been the one, but he isn't, and I'll tell you why in a minute. It was her insistence that it happened. She felt that unless the Jews, as they did in biblical times, had their own country, their own nation, they would never, ever be safe anywhere. They would always been at the mercy of the various courts or governments of the places where they lived. And so what she did, she went to the Sultan and she said, look, you've got this part of what I'm going to call the Holy Land in those days. It's a wasteland. You're not getting any revenues from it. It's just, there's nothing there. And the holy city of Tiberias, which they always thought of, the Jews did, as holy, is in ruins. The walls of the city are down. Everything is in a mess. And she said, look, I'm going to offer you what should be the revenues of that city for 10 years. And they settled on a sum if it was a thriving city. And I'm going to bring my refugees into Tiberias. Oh, says the Sultan, money, money, money. Yes, yes, yes. So they make this deal. And her idea is that they're going to restart the citrus groves that were very big there. And they're going to make their money and also sericulture, the making of silk cloth. And so we're going to have industries there. And from the industries, I will get enough money to pay off the Sultan with what we promised we'd give him every year. So she tries to do this, but she's old by this time. She's in her 60s. And what happens is that the pirates on the Mediterranean was full of pirate ships at those times, out of actually North Africa mostly. And they heard that Jewish refugees were going to be coming into the Holy Land by ship. And they thought this was going to be a bonanza for them. but the word gets back to these refugees that if you go on to the Holy Land from the Ottoman Empire, where you are, Salonika or Istanbul, wherever you are, you're going to run into trouble. And they didn't want to take those journeys. So she couldn't get the people to come and to populate the Tiberias and rebuild it.
Fascinating.
So she never really ended up fulfilling that part of her mission.
I've seen a lot of people asking in the comments the sort of obvious underlying question for all of this, which is how do you tell us about your research? Because when you began this book, there had not been a modern account of her life written. So tell us about your research and your process and where you found these archival documents.
Well, that's true. Every time when I started out, they said, we don't have anything. We have very little on her, and whatever we had, Cecil Roth put into a very, very little book, and he didn't even say where he got it. So if we haven't found anything in 500 years, why are you trying? Someone did. So I said, all right, okay. So I come out of news reporting, and anybody tells me that, it makes me try harder. So, which is what I did. And it took about 6 years. What I did was that, first of all, I found any mention that we could that traced back to a document. Mm-hmm. And then we looked where that document had come from and tried to find more. I'll give you one example. When she was in Ferrara, she used a particular notary. So I had one of my helpers, and I had a wonderful helper in Ferrara, as a matter of fact, and a young American graduate student. And I said, you've got to look up in this particular folder, because the folders in the Ferrara archives were all by notary. Although it was a notary 500 years earlier, if there were a couple of documents where she'd used this notary, chances are there were more. Wow. So that was one of the ways we did it. I mean, it was like a jigsaw puzzle of 5,000 pieces.
So give us a sense of like where some of these documents were. I mean, how far?
They were never under her name. They were always under somebody else. So you had to find the somebody else. And if you know who she dealt with, and that who she dealt with was much more important person, then you could go to their files and see if the bank or she was named in any of their documents.
So she sort of left a trail of documents across Europe, but not in one folder.
No, I wish she had. If she had, it would have been wonderful, and that's why everybody else gave up, because there was no way of finding a central cache of her own documents. Do I think there are her own documents? Yes, I do. And oh gosh, what's the name of that place? There is a monastery just outside of Salonika, high up, perched on a hill, a very, very old one. And Athos, the Mount Athos, Athos. And I am certain, no, not certain, I always felt that if she was going to have her documents put anywhere upon her death or before her death, she was going to go there. She probably gave them a handsome donation. And because you can't get into Mount Athos's monastery. Only men are allowed in, and even then, not many men. It's one of those remote places that you can't get into, and no one's ever tried, except the people who were there. And that's the sort of place she probably would have. And probably it has one of the finest collections of European history in the whole wide world. But you can't get into it.
The relationship between these conversos and the monasteries is something comes up in your book. Totally yes. Fascinating. If we had more time, I would want to get into it. But I want to ask, there's a sense in which this was sort of a lost story. I mean, over the past decade, there have been a number, since your book was published, I believe your book came out in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. Since then, there have been a number of historical novels written about Doña Gracia, more than one series in Hebrew. But before that, it was not something that was widely known. I wonder if there was a sense in which this was a hidden story or a forgotten story, and if you have any thoughts as to why this was not.
I do. I don't think it was hidden. I think that the fact that she was a businesswoman, a woman and in business, was not the kind of history of the Jews that, if you look back, the Jewish historians ever covered. They covered the great thinkers. They covered the great clergy. They covered the calamities. And why the calamities? Because it was always known that the Messiah would come after a great calamity. So every time there was a calamity, they wrote up the history, but they never thought to write about a woman, and they never thought to write, I mean, none of the business people in past centuries, the brilliant Jewish business leaders, even Diogo Mendes himself, they don't think of those people as suitable fodder for historical research. So I don't think she was overlooked because of anything nefarious. I think she was just overlooked because she was a woman and because she was no, they didn't like that. They had no patience with something.
And how did you choose to devote yourself to this story?
Two things which attracted me. One is I just started a program at Yale University called the Women's Campaign School at Yale, where we began to train women in campaign skills to win elections. This was 93, long before there were a lot of women in government, certainly in senior government. And I wanted to start a training program for them. And we've done that, and 20 some years later, it's a really, really good program. And we bring them in just for about a week and 10 days at a time, or we go travel to other campuses and do it. It's not for the students, it's for women worldwide, and they've been attending. So I was very big on trying to give women better opportunities. So I guess she attracted me on that score. The other is that I joined the Gomez Millhouse as a board member. The Gomez Millhouse is the only house museum, I think, in North America that is dedicated to a Jewish businessman who lived at the beginning of the 1700s. And it seemed that those kinds of people, he was also Sephardic, those kinds of people had gotten lost. I would say getting lost is probably the best way to look at it. So I was very interested in them. And I was also doing a curriculum in Sephardic history called Out of Spain. And I needed to have some more information myself to learn more. And I fell over her and realized there was virtually nothing on her.
I'm descended from the Gomez of the Gomez Millhouse. It's funny you bring that up. I want to move on to the questions that people have been putting into the comment box. But first, Andrée, I wonder if you could just sum up your comments a little bit, sort of bring us forward to today and what this all means.
Okay, I've got some summary comments before we get to the actual questions. First of all, she taught me a lot, and she taught us a lot, and she's very good to teach us all. Among them are the following: to avoid using your own money where possible in any business venture, the value of having a plan A and plan B, and making sure to execute both at the same time where feasible, rather than waiting for one to fail before another one is initiated, the value of having an exit strategy before you start a venture, the benefit of using low interest or no interest loans where possible rather than outright bribes, and never, ever, ever, ever burn your bridges, flexing your financial muscle by providing even philanthropic funds where they needed to be used and they needed to be spent as cash, using actual grants only when you must, always and always tempt your patrons with the tease of more loans rather than bribes, so that, okay, I'll give you this loan, you pay it back, you'll get some more money. And you use more powerful folks, she was great at this, to intercede on your behalf whenever it's needed, particularly non-Jews who would do a lot for you. Not easily give up on any idea, even if it doesn't work out at first, and you just try again and try again. And always hit back immediately. You're attacked or challenged, as happened when her sister betrayed her in Venice or when she was robbed unlawfully in Milan. And know your value of being regal. I don't think we can underestimate the fact that she didn't try to burn a bra. She was very elegantly dressed and it mattered to her. We even have one document where she wants permission to keep wearing her elegant Venetian dress when she's in Constantinople, and she had to have a special document to do so. So those are mainly some points that I learned from her. You can learn from her. We can all learn from her.
There's some great questions here. You know, there's one I think that it is really good because it gets at some of the nuances of how the Inquisition worked that we didn't get so deeply into, and I think are often confusing. Someone asked if they converted, meaning the conversos, why did they have to leave?
They didn't have to leave. They wanted to leave because what happened was that the non-Jews were forever betraying them to what was called the Holy Office, the Inquisition chapter house in various towns, because if they gave away these people and argued that they weren't being sincere Catholics, they could reap a nice fancy reward. And so that meant that they couldn't even do business. I mean, if you've got tenants, for example, in a building, and they don't want to pay their rent, they just say, oh, well, we're going to betray you to the Holy Office and say that you're lighting candles on Friday or not eating pork or whatever they might think. And the Inquisition didn't even have to prove anything. They just came and arrested them and put them in jail and took away all their assets.
Right. And that's an important point that when we talk about the Inquisition, what the Inquisition was going after conversos to prove whether or not they were actually true converts. And that's all the torture and everything that we read about, that was directed at conversos.
Yeah, but you've got to remember one thing. They really didn't care whether they were sincere Catholics. They cared that they had assets. So you find
that's why they had to leave.
Going after the wealthier ones rather than just the very poor ones in greater numbers after the wealthy ones. The other thing about the Inquisition is that I discovered that I think is interesting is because they were now baptized according to church doctrine, you couldn't take any blood. You couldn't draw blood. You couldn't hurt them in any way that they would bleed. So you had to find all of these tortures that didn't require you to bleed them because that was against church doctrine. So that's why all of these pulleys and everything else that they seem to come up with in the middle of the night, God knows if you can't get to sleep, maybe that's what you do, were developed.
There's a couple of questions about what happened next, and I sort of left the story off, with Tiberius, but basically, people are asking, did she have descendants? Where was she buried? I wonder if you could just talk about what happened to the family after she died.
Yes. First of all, we don't have any definitive note that she had died. So we don't know where, but if you can put together so circumstantial evidence, it was obviously she was still in Istanbul. She'd not gone to the Holy Land. How did she die? I got so stuck up and hung up on that because I'd found so many documents on so many aspects of her life. And it's still going on, by the way. There is one researcher, I don't want to tell you where he is, and who has recently found for the first time her signature and seal. But
wow.
We don't know how she died. So, and I can't tell you the whole story because it's too long, but I got so frustrated and I've been so careful. I didn't want the academics to think that I wasn't, dotting my I's and crossing my T's, every one of them. And so I decided I'd take a giant leap, and I wouldn't use it, but I'd take a leap to try and find out how she died. Because yes, I can understand your question. So I went to a psychic, but I didn't go to one psychic. It's sort of like having your estimate for a roof on your house. You go to a couple of them, maybe 3 of them. So I went to 2 of them. And I went to one was a man, one was a woman, and they were completely separate. And I wanted to know what they thought was the way that she died. I can go on with that, but I think we've got some more questions.
Sure. Sorry, I'm just looking through. There's so many questions here. Someone's asking to talk about Ancona, which is a fascinating moment in her story. I had a question about that, which is, you can talk about, there was an incident where some Jews were in prison in the Italian city of Ancona, and she tried to intercede. The way in which she interceded was by asking the Sultan to intercede on her behalf with the Pope, which is incredible. I just wonder if you can tell that story a little bit and how that worked and how she was able to have the most powerful person in the world intercede with another of the most powerful people in the world on her behalf.
And it comes down to money again.
Mm-hmm.
She told the Sultan that she would not have enough cash to pay the installment on, they had a concession of importing alcohol because they were not Muslim. And she told, well, unless you can do something for me, I'm not going to be able to pay you what I'm supposed to pay you. You'll have to wait. And the Sultan doesn't want to wait for his money. So he says, what can I do for you? And then she tells the sad story. And it really was that one of her agents had been rounded up in Ancona and was going to be killed by the Inquisition, was going to be burned at the stake. No, I think it was burned at the stake or put out for the, what do they call it, where they rode them to death. They had to, anyway. He says, all right, already, if I want my money, I suppose I'm going to have to help you out. And he writes to the Pope and says, look, I think there's been a mistake here. You rounded up one of Doña Gracia's own people when you were rounding up Jews that you wanted to kill at this point in time for various reasons, or conversos, and Jews at that point. And so unfortunately, because it takes a long time for correspondence to reach their goal in those days of months, I mean, it's not like today. So he said, oh, I'm so sorry. He writes back, we've already had the execution, and she's gone. So she didn't make it that time. But she managed to get well, it was always, if you want more money out of us, as being the merchant princes, that's what we're going to call merchant princes, you're going to have to bend a little. And she did that her life long.
I think that's quite a place to end it. I really appreciate this. It's been fascinating. This again, Andrée Brooks's book is The Woman Who Defied Kings. I don't know if they're gonna. Sorry, I got a little glare here. But the link to the Amazon page is in the chat. I don't know if Ariel was going to come back on, and
yes, she's on.
There
she is.
I'm here. I'm so sorry about my internet earlier. Yes, I'm so grateful to you, Andrée and Josh, for this amazing discussion. We've had so many comments. There should be a movie about her. We completely agree.
There is.
Tell us about it.
Yes, I haven't had a time to talk about a lot of things. We are signing an option for a TV miniseries.
Look at that.
It's not a movie. It's much too much a TV miniseries, if you think about it, because there are so many aspects to her life, and it separates out on an episode basis per episode. So that's what's being worked on right now, and I hope that it will go through. We've had other tries over the years that haven't, because it's very, very expensive to make a period piece like this. And you have to have a lot of really interested investors. So that may be coming down the pike. We aren't sure, but I would like it to be, and hope that it will.
That's so exciting. We hope very much that you will keep us posted.
Well, I would like it because, to me, maybe because I'm a media person, and I think Josh will understand this, if you don't capture the media, and of course, in Ukraine, they understand it so well. If you don't capture the media in this day and age, you don't capture people's hearts and minds. You must. And so, I mean, the book is all well and good, but you need much more than that. And I'm not talking about a documentary even, I'm talking about a recreation, a fictional historical drama, because I think that also captures people. I don't think documentaries do. Some of them do, very few.
I think that's right. That's right.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much, and thanks so much to everyone who's here with us this evening. We are recording. We did record this event, so we'll send out the link to the recording tomorrow once it's up on our YouTube page and our website, along with just a short survey. We always appreciate your feedback for our programs. Again, I highly encourage you to buy The Woman Who Defied Kings, The Life and Times of Doña Gracia Nasi, which the link is in the chat. And please, we do hope that you will consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs. You can also, I'm going to include that that link in the chat as well. So thank you all so much. I wish you a very sweet evening. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, John. Josh, it was a pleasure working with you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed chatting. Thank you.